In this video, I'm going to show how to create a wooden jar lid like the ones you're seeing in the picture. The first step is to create a waste block onto which we can glue our piece of wood that we're going to use for our lid. So I clean up the face of this and just make sure that the outer edge stands out a bit further than the rest, and that the diameter is about the diameter of the top of the final lid. Next, we need to prepare our block of wood. So the first thing I do is find center, and it can be approximate. I also look at the wood and figure out which side I want to use for the outside that is visible. So I'm going to be poking a bit of a hole into the rough side of this piece. Next, I put something down on the ways to keep the glue off of them. I'm using a medium CA, I believe. It doesn't run, but it isn't super thick. And I spread it evenly around just the outer edge. That's my attempt at keeping the nozzle from clogging. So now I've got my 2P10 activator, and I spray the part that's going to contact the glue so that it sets up much faster. And I put my tail right in the center, slam it into the waste block, and put a little bit of pressure. Don't need to go crazy. And I wait a minute and give it a whirl, dry it off a little. Now this is probably a minute or two later, just to be on the safe side. And I've got my block of wood mounted. I removed the tailstock. This is a pretty light piece of wood. I'm not too worried about it, and it's on there pretty solidly. I use my bowl gouge to true this up and make it round. And I keep my vacuum relatively close by, catch as much dust as I can. Stop the lathe for a moment and move the tool rest a little bit closer for safety. And I sped things up a little bit more now that it's pretty round so that I can clean that up really quickly. This part creates a lot of dust. This walnut is particularly dusty. And I keep a little piece of foam on my ways so I can drop my tool pretty quickly. Next, I take one of the rims and I just press it into the wood for a moment at a high speed, and it creates a mark that you can see pretty well. So I trim this down to a more reasonable thickness. And you can imagine the inner part of that circle where the indent is what I'm going to be removing. So I get my tool rest lined up the right height and just start coring this out a little bit. Pretty quick process. And at this point, I need to figure out the depth And I think I acted a little prematurely by coring that out a little bit. I could have done that after I figured out the depth. But right here you could see I'm figuring that I need a little bit on the top for stability. And that's about where the where the lid will come when I press it in to that block of wood. So I can very quickly take all of this out and get it to the height that I expect or need. And one thing I learned is that these jar lids need to be about as thin as you can make them. They look really silly when they're too thick. So here again, I remark the center, or remark where the lid is going to squeeze in there, or the rim. And then I attempt to core it out again. I don't pay too much attention to the cleanliness of the cuts in here because the bands and lids are going to cover the wood on the inside. Now here I'm using a diamond parting tool, actually. Seems to be the best tool for the job here to work quickly. And I file that, or I grind that on my grinder so that one of the edges is sharp. And you're going to see me use that top left edge as a cutting edge. And it allows me to do this very quickly. So I can go right off into the side of that piece. And here I'm using my blower to get some chips out of the way, which probably pushes around more dust, but it's a quick cleanup. And now I just keep measuring little by little. I mean, if you go too much, it's too late and you can't recover from it and you have to throw the piece out. So definitely take your time and go little by little. And I'm focusing on the depth as well as the diameter. And I'm pressing it in, and you can see that the lip of the band presses right up against the face of the wood quite nicely. And you want it to be pretty snug. You can see here I have to use a screwdriver to pry it out of there. Now you will see the wood. You see I just made a little divot. You will see the wood where I'm using that screwdriver. So you do want to be careful not to mar that up too badly. And at this point, we have our inner thickness established. So we just clean up the outside to get it to the thickness we want the entire lid assembly to be. And again, thinner is better. I haven't seen a case where you want it to be thicker. Even with the big thick jars, the thin lids seem to look better. Do a microsecond of a shear scrape there to clean up that edge. You can see it's pretty rough still. More shear scraping. And I'm trying to round that over a little bit on the top side. And here you can see I do just a quick visual check how that's to see how that's going to look. And I continue to thin it out. As I said, thinner looks better. And then I give it a quick sanding. And this walnut shines up pretty nicely with sandpaper alone. Sometimes I stop to hand sand any scratches. Once I'm satisfied with the lid, I get everything out of the way and put a piece of foam down. I've since switched to using a thicker towel that covers the entire ways. But I use a chisel and a hammer. A mallet would be better. And I just tap it a few times and then rotate it. And you can see I'm wedging the chisel in there, and because I only glued the very outer edge, I'm able to pop that lid right off of the waste block. And that's a trick I learned from Damon Harmon, one of our club members. At this point, I need to clean up the outside of the lid. So I use expansion chucking for this. You might want to do something else. You just have to be super careful with this method to make sure you don't crack the lid. And I make it just tight enough to be able to do a couple quick passes. And I should have used a different technique for this, but I was taking the quick and easy way. And once you've cleaned up and gotten the shape you like, you can go ahead and sand. So I use 220 and I work my way up to 400, maybe even 600. After the sanding is complete, it's time to put the band and the lid, the metal lid, into our wooden lid. So I take this over to my workbench and use the same CA glue that I used to mount the walnut to the waste block. And the trick here is to just put a bead of glue around the outer edge where the metal band makes contact. And keep in mind, you'll want to make sure that this adheres well, because there is some twisting force on this. If you screw the jar lid in too tight, the wood can separate when you unscrew it. So I just pressure fit that in with my hand at first, and then I use my bench vise to seat it in all the way. And after that, it's time to glue the metal lid in. Now, you don't have to glue this in if you want it to be replaceable. In this particular case, I wanted to make it permanent. So I just put a bead of CA around the outside again and drop the metal lid in place. Now the last step, I'm not sure it's required, but I have to imagine it helps to seat the jar into the lid so that everything lines up nicely when it dries. Now I wanted to show you a few of the different finishes and how they look. So the far left is sanded up to 600 and then buffed on the Beal buffing system. The middle doesn't have any finish, and the far right has just a rubbed on walnut oil, or maybe it was tried and true, I don't remember at this point. Now the far right, you can tell, looks a little funky. It's because the lid is too thick. It doesn't really even fit the bigger jar. So again, you just want to go about as thin as you can go and still maintain some integrity. Thanks for watching.